Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have bad, good, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. So we have the same usual martinis, just in a different order. Jim, I'm happy to report I know what day it is today. And let's get to our bad martini first. This was a cryptic story for most of yesterday in the afternoon and evening, and we've gotten a little more clarity to make the story a little more serious here on Friday. Ronan Farrow, who, of course, is famous now for exposing the horrific actions of Harvey Weinstein and is probably about to blow the lid off of NBC as well, has been looking into an allegation that nobody outside of very few people knew about until yesterday, and that's an allegation against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. The first whiff that the public got of this was when Dianne Feinstein, the top Democrat in the Senate Judiciary Committee, issued what has to be one of the most cryptic statements we've ever seen, saying, "I have received information from an individual concerning the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. That individual strongly requested confidentiality, declined to come forward or press the matter further, and I have honored that decision. I have, however, referred the matter to federal investigative authorities." So obviously that could mean almost anything. And Ronan Farrow has gotten to the bottom of the story here. The complaint came from a woman who accused Kavanaugh of sexual misconduct when they were both in high school more than 30 years ago. The woman, who has asked not to be identified, first approached Democratic lawmakers in July, shortly after Trump nominated Kavanaugh. The allegation dates back to the early 1980s, when Kavanaugh was a high school student at Georgetown Preparatory School in Bethesda, Maryland, and the woman attended a nearby high school. In the letter, the woman alleged that during an encounter at a party, Kavanaugh held her down and that he attempted to force himself on her. She claimed in the letter that Kavanaugh and a classmate of his, both of whom had been drinking, turned up music that was playing in the room to conceal the sound of her protests, and that Kavanaugh covered her mouth with his hand. She was able to free herself, although the alleged incident took place decades ago, and the three individuals involved were minors. The woman said that the memory had been a source of ongoing distress for her, and that she had sought psychological treatment as a result. In a statement, Kavanaugh said, quote, "I categorically and unequivocally deny this allegation. I did not do this back in high school or at any time." Kavanaugh's classmate said of the woman's allegation, "I have no recollection of that." The woman declined Farrow's request for an interview. So, Jim, we had seen some stories last night that the allegation was merely that he had locked a girl in a room during high school. This is clearly more serious. However, he's strongly denying it. We don't really have a lot of evidence to go one way or the other. The fact that the Democrats didn't bring this up until it was pretty clear Kavanaugh was on the smooth track to confirmation certainly raises eyebrows on the right. So how do we digest all this?
Yeah, this is a bad martini any way you look at it. I think it's safe to say that if the allegation against Kavanaugh is true, then this is very bad news. This is an extremely serious act, potentially a crime, even though the statute of limitations probably has passed. If it's not true, then a good man is having his reputation smirched and smeared, a last-ditch effort to derail his nomination. And I'd be curious about, with sympathy towards the accuser, assuming this actually happened, what exactly are people supposed to do here? As you noted, Kavanaugh denies it. The other guy who was in the room with him denies it. There's no forensic evidence presumably left over from this alleged act back in 1982. We've come across no corroborating witnesses that we know of. Georgetown Prep, the high school, said they never heard anything about it. This morning, 65 of his female high school peers wrote a letter in support, and the accuser will not come forward. What's supposed to happen here, right? Vote no against him because of this accusation from somebody who won't do it, who won't, come forward and accuse on the record. I don't think you can say that's a legitimate or appropriate response to this. There are false accusations that get made in this world. And the other thing that really jumps out at me, the thing that made everybody say, "Oh my goodness, this is a much bigger deal than we thought," is Ronan Farrow of the New Yorker, the slayer of Harvey Weinstein, the go-to guy when it comes to serious accusations like this, is one of the co-authors of this story. It is worth noting that Jane Meyer is the other co-author. Jane Meyer has written a lot about the Supreme Court. She had a long and distinguished career, but she, one of her big moments in her career was a piece that trashed Clarence Thomas and his nomination process. I believe one of her other books trashes the Koch brothers. We know where Jane Meyer is coming from. And Greg, if I asked you to describe, what are the hallmarks of Ronan Farrow's reporting on these sorts of accusations, I think the things that would come to mind are detail, specifics, names, dates, places, as much corroborating evidence as possible to make, clear and certain and indisputable that the accused was in the place at the time during this accusation. With this report, we get nothing, right? We don't know the name of the person. We know roughly the year. We don't know the locality. We don't know which house. We don't know the names of the people who were there. We certainly don't have anyone who this accuser told at the time. No contemporaneous accounts. I mean, like when the Washington Post did their story on Roy Moore, when one of the young women described meeting Moore outside the hearing for her parents' divorce, the Washington Post went down to the courthouse records and checked to see if Roy Moore was presiding and would be in the courthouse on that day that she described. And so, and was it the same day as the parents' divorce? And they at least were able to check that out. Now, you can argue whether or not that verifies the accusation against Moore, but at least it says, aha, okay, they were in the same place at the same time, so this could have happened. We don't get any of that. And so now the people who are no doubt saying, well, we can't vote to confirm Kavanaugh now, that basically anyone making an anonymous accusation should be able to derail someone's career. And if this becomes the new standard, you're going to see this everywhere against everybody. We will hopefully learn more. If we don't learn any more, I don't think there's nothing else that can be done with this accusation. Ronan Farrow has built up a great deal of credibility because the allegations he writes about check out, and there's all of these details and all that stuff. We're not getting that in this case. We will see what happens if things check out. But the other interesting wrinkle in this is that Dianne Feinstein apparently has known about this information since late July, which means you've got late July, all of August. We're now in the middle of September, and she refers it to the FBI after the confirmation hearing and leaks it, but doesn't give any specifics about what the allegation is about. It's very hard to say that Dianne Feinstein has covered herself in glory here. So grim either way. My suspicion is we will not hear more about this. I think if you want to keep someone off the Supreme Court making an allegation this serious, I think you have to come forward. I don't think you can do this anonymously and expect everyone to find your accusation credible and valid. I think, everyone else in Me Too has been this repeated pattern of behavior, fairly recent, by the way. We're not talking about, 1980, early 1980s. And that's not what we've got here. And everybody else who's worked with Brett Kavanaugh talked about what a terrific guy he is and how he'd never do anything like this. So we'll see what it shakes out. The best case scenario, and I say this, that tongue-in-cheek and sarcastically, Greg, is that a good man is having his reputation destroyed right now.
What do you do if you're Chuck Grassley and the Senate Judiciary Committee here? Because as soon as whoever in Feinstein's office sent out the statement, you had folks all across the Democratic spectrum, even when we had zero information about anything at that point, other than that there had been a referral to the FBI. Well, we're just going to have to delay the vote, which shows the political opportunism that they're showing there. So what do you expect Grassley to do?
Although it's worth noting this, we haven't seen on-the-record sources and the public statement about this, but that the FBI looked at it, referred it to the White House, and said it would not be opening up a criminal investigation. I'm assuming because, A, I don't think there's any federal crime that's being alleged here. 2, I believe the statute of limitations is expired. 3, maybe the FBI doesn't have it. Like, as far as we know, the only people who've talked to the accuser are in Eshu's office, and this is the Congresswoman Eshu's office, and maybe in Feinstein's office. She doesn't want to go pursue this any further. So I don't know what's supposed to be done. The only thing I can think of, if I were truly thinking partisan and devious, Greg, would be to delay the vote further to put it closer to Election Day for all of those red state Democrats.
We'll see what happens. Let's move to our good martini now, and we're still sticking with the Supreme Court confirmation process. And not a lot of liberals very fond of Brett Kavanaugh, because most liberals not very fond of the man who nominated Brett Kavanaugh. Ruth Bader Ginsburg held a session earlier this week at George Washington University. She was being interviewed for the event by California Supreme Court Justice Goodwin Liu, former clerk for Ginsburg, and he asked her, wow, you got confirmed 96-3. It's a little different than what we're seeing today. What do you think about how things have changed?
How would you compare the process that you went through with what's going on today in that process?
The way it was right. The way it is wrong.
She says she got easily confirmed. Stephen Breyer got easily confirmed. On the other side, conservative Antonin Scalia unanimously confirmed back in 1986. And she says that's much closer to the way it should be.
But that's the way it should be. Instead of what it's become, which is a highly partisan show. The Republicans move in lockstep, and so do the Democrats. I wish I could wave a magic wand and have it go back.
The Democrats are having enough time making themselves very credible with the way they went after Brett Kavanaugh at the hearing. When you've even got Ruth Bader Ginsburg dumping on you, it makes you feel even worse, hopefully.
Yeah, and let's give credit to Ruth Bader Ginsburg for saying something that people in that audience probably didn't want to hear, and that her fan base doesn't want to hear. As far as they're probably pretty convinced that everything being done against Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, and by golly, we're finally holding giving the Republicans a taste of their own medicine, and no. And she's like, no, it was better back then, back when she and Scalia were confirmed by wide margins. God bless her for saying things that she sees and that I think are accurate, even if they're not what the audience wants to hear. I will point out, though, Greg, did we have some audio problems on her comment? Was she quieter than normal?
She was very hushed and very deliberate. There was an extra section of that where she took a long time to say she wanted to wave the magic wand to go back to the way it was. And that was about an extra 15 seconds to say the last few words there. So as Trump might have said to Jeb Bush a couple of years back, she was low energy.
Yeah, we all remember the image of her, with her head down at the State of the Union a few years ago. She joked that she'd had a bit too much wine. Justice Ginsburg, we've all been there. We've all wanted to take naps during the middle of the State of the Union. God bless you. I do point out, though, that she's 85, and I don't think it's outrageous to say that in that clip she sounded like it. I hope she's feeling well. Perhaps that explains a bit about why these Supreme Court fights are just so intense, and that's not exactly. I know I keep seeing. NBC today is doing another feature on her amazing workout routine. And, God bless her. That's great, but a little quiet the other day at GW. I hope she's well.
Man, if you thought the fight over Kennedy's replacement was volcanic, if Trump has the opportunity with the Republican Senate to nominate Ginsburg's replacement in the next couple of years, look out. We haven't seen anything yet. All right, let's move on to our crazy martini now. We went bad, good, and now crazy. For the crazy, we go to the pages of the New York Times. The State Department spent $52,701 last year buying customized and mechanized curtains for the picture windows in Nikki R. Haley's official residence as ambassador to the United Nations, just as the department was undergoing deep budget cuts and had frozen hiring. The residence in a new building on First Avenue has spectacular views, and Ms. Haley is the first ambassador to live in it. For decades, her predecessors lived in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, but after the hotel was purchased by a Chinese insurance company with a murky ownership structure, the State Department decided in 2016 to find a new home for its top New York diplomat because of security concerns. The government leased the apartment just blocks from the delegation's offices with an option to buy, according to Patrick Kennedy, the top management official at the State Department during the Obama administration. The full-floor penthouse with handsome hardwood floors covering large open spaces stretching nearly 6,000 feet was listed at $58,000 a month. But here's the kicker, which really kind of makes the story irrelevant in terms of trying to slam Nikki Haley. A spokesman for Ms. Haley said plans to buy the curtains were made in 2016. during the Obama administration. Ms. Haley had no say in the purchase, he said. So, Jim, we got this blazing headline. State Department spent $52,701 on curtains for Nikki Haley's residence. Kind of leaves the impression that Nikki Haley had something to do with it. Turns out she had nothing to do with it at all.
The New York Times must feel like a punching bag, and it kind of deserves to feel like a punching bag because of how often this sort of thing happens. You almost wonder, are the headline writers, the copy editors who are writing the headlines, paying attention to what's in the story? Do they just tune out after the first one or two paragraphs? If you're going to make a piece that slams Nikki Haley, you need to make sure that she is responsible for what you are slamming her for. It is not the case. Now, what's also worth noting is that before Nikki Haley was in this ambassador's residence, the U.S. ambassador then stayed at the 42nd floor of the Waldorf Towers. Rent was about $135,000 a month. The rent for Haley is roughly half that price. So even with the new curtains, the taxpayer is getting a savings compared to the old one. I noticed the New York Times didn't really seem to be bothered by any spending under Susan Rice or any of the previous administration's U.S. ambassadors to the UN. If you want to have a broad argument of does the federal government pay too much for its furniture, for its furnishings, for all of their stuff, Greg, I am fine having that conversation. You and I have talked about the coffee table the various conference tables under Ben Carson and spending under Scott Pruitt. That's fine. That's great. I think there's a lot of cases where once people start realizing they're spending taxpayer money, they say, "Oh, let's get the ultra luxurious one." I don't think this counts as a example, or if it does, it's fairly standard, and it's the decision was made under the previous administration. I don't like this fair weather interest in excessive spending only when it happens under an administration we don't like. And the New York Times basically lived down to the example of its critics by making such a egregiously obvious hit job in which the contention of the headline is contradicted by the sixth paragraph.
They keep getting all in a twist about being labeled fake news, and maybe sometimes they get called fake news for stories that some people just don't like. But a lot of times the stories are exactly like this. They leave an impression, and they even look to be trying to create an impression when the facts just aren't there to back it up.
And people just don't buy the argument that these are a series of innocent mistakes that just happen to always hit one party harder than the other.
Exactly. And they are getting a lot of blowback. Jake Tapper had a pretty long thread about it on Twitter, and some others are going after the Times for it today, too. So a nice bipartisan response to smack down the bias there. Jim, have a fantastic weekend. We'll reconvene on Monday. Talk to you then.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Again, have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and please do join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.